Welcome to the first panel of the symposium. I'm the moderator, Rob Fitterman. Robert Fitterman, could either one is fine. Alfabeti del Corpo, Gender Translation Activism is a two-day symposium exploring intersections of feminism, abolition, and translation studies. Our panel is titled Sound Translingualism and Motherless Tongues, and it will explore challenges and creative strategies in translating experimental writing, paying special attention to questions of performance and musicality, sonic and visual form as they trigger new means of transporting poetic text from one language into another. Rather than trying to stabilize the difficulties in translation, translingualism embraces or even amplifies the instabilities in a text when it travels from one language to another. The panelists, Alison Grimaldi-Donahue, Eugene Ostashevsky, and Jennifer Scapitone, will explore the ways in which translingual writing can be read as a critique of conventional translation ideology, and how to translate phenomena such as the sound of a poet's voice, which conditions their reception as outsider or national representative. Beyond being accomplished translators, each member of our panel is widely published as practicing poets themselves. Their own creative works, as you will hear at some point, draw on their translations and research. So our plan is for each panelist to present, and at the completion of all three presentations, we'll have a short roundtable discussion amongst the panelists to highlight some of the shared ideas, and then hopefully have a conversation with you all as a Q&A. I had planned on reading a bit of biography, but I realize you have that in your program, so for the sake of time, I would refer you to the program to have a look at the complete biographies. We are reading in alphabetical order, presenting in alphabetical order as an echo of the title of the symposium. So, we begin with Alison Grimaldi-Donahue.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Rob. I'm very excited to be here in this beautiful place. So today I wanted to talk about Patrizia Vicinelli and some translations and writing I've been working on about her. A lot of folks don't know who she is. Maybe some of you do. But she was a poet from Bologna. She was born in 1943 and died in 1991 in Bologna. She died of AIDS-related illness, which I think is important to remember because she didn't have a rough life, but she made choices that made her life rough. And she was a very adventurous spirit. But I recently had the chance to meet a friend of hers, Alberto Masala, another poet, who told me, "Ma era una signora," because he's very strong, let's say, about the fact that he wants her to be remembered as an elegant, wise human being, despite a life of drug addiction. And so I wanted to mention that. And she did live, she was born and she died in Bologna, but she didn't really spend most of her life in Bologna. She was born into a middle-class family with all of its advantages, but she moved around a lot in search of adventure, in search of poetry. She spent time in Rome a great deal, throughout Europe, working with international poets of different scenes, which I'll talk a bit about. She also spent a lot of time in Morocco, in exile. She was arrested for hash possession at a certain point in her life, and to escape prison, ran to Morocco for a couple of years. Upon return, she spent 8 months in Rebibbia, during which time she staged a version of Cinderella, a feminist, quote-unquote feminist version, because she would have never called herself a feminist, actually, but she did embody feminism. with the women with whom she was incarcerated. So she did a lot of things. She wrote a lot. in different forms. And so these are 3 different pictures of her. She also worked as an actress. Her second husband was a film director, Castiglioni, and so these are different moments of her life. A couple of years ago at Macro in Rome, there was an exhibition of a lot of her visual poetry and concrete poetry. It was an excellent show. They had some audio and they had a lot of visual work. And there's been somewhat of a resurgence surrounding her, whether that's via exhibitions or including her in texts, or there's a theater company in Bologna currently working on a play about her. So there are things happening. Today I'm going to focus on some of her longer work, but these shorter visual poems are extremely beautiful. And these are both excerpts. One is an excerpt from the show in Rome from a couple of years ago, and another is pulled from the Fondazione Bonotto website. Fondazione Bonotto, plenty of you probably know, and also the video I'm going to show comes from them, is a foundation of a textile industry near Vicenza, where they have an excellent online digitalized archive, and you can actually visit the space, and they have a lot of Fluxus works and Italian concrete poetry on the factory floor, which is kind of an experience. Before getting started, though, I wanted to share a bit of Patrizia reading, because I wanted to think about how she reads the poems. It's very difficult to translate a poet like this, I think, because a lot of it comes from her voice and her existence. And so a direct translation, in my opinion, what I'm arguing for, isn't maybe what is necessary to understanding her work, because it's difficult to give justice to someone who had such a particular voice. And it's not an affected voice by any means, but it's a particular style of reading. So this is a short video excerpt of her giving a reading.
Dice lei l'aveva sognato lungo l'intera notte precedente. Piangeva urlando, chiedeva perdono e glielo aveva detto anche, lo amava a lutto. Nella condizione nuova e oltremodo aberrante, freddo divinatore dentro cattedrali gotiche a meditare passioni da 16 anni, ambientate in nuragiche praterie, colori di folli espoir, in un'area più profondamente corrispettiva del tempo, città grigie del nord, a tratti illuminati dal sole anche d'inverno, somigliano tutte a New York, dalle modulazioni e armonie come traiettorie, anche l'invisibile vapore che circonda il suolo, che calpestiamo a volte, ogni cosa provoca, infonde e fa scoppiare di colpo una passione e fuoco di cellula in cellula che non la estirpi ma non ci provare, perché ti ritorna senza più contorni come centauro, padrone dei passati ora inutili, la forma imprevedibile che assume questa violenza dapprima come grande sorpresa, poi come ossessione, dramma, mai disperazione. Attesa insaziabile invece e oasi inventate in viaggi fittizi, come lontananza fu il mostro attorcigliato, fu desiderio che infine prende forma in un corpo, qualcosa di inespresso che attraverso tante mancanze e negazioni, per negazione al fine giunge alla sua meta e stancamente si apre e si dà come una mela che si spacca come seno di gravida, come sole africano, come mare che lambisce il corpo, come uomo splendente nella sua forma di maschio come donna, radice del darsi di ogni impronta di voluta apertura.
So you can see that her reading is completely coming from her body. She's giving it a lot of emphasis and energy, and she's very comfortable with the camera, which I think is remarkable. And so in translating something like this, it feels that as a translator and as a performer, one doesn't want to try and imitate, because that would just be silly. And so trying to find a solution. Became a little bit obsessed with her when I was looking for poets around Gruppo 63. She was never really a member of Gruppo 63, not that anyone was a card-carrying member, let's say. But she kind of existed in that environment. She existed in and out of a lot of different poetic realities. She was part of Gruppo 63 on the outskirts. She also frequented Il Mulino di Bazzano, where Adriano Spatola and Giulia Nicolai live. But I also became interested in her because of this idea of an epic poem written by a woman, which was happening at the time. And so I was very taken by Non Sempre Ricordano, because it's a story of a making of self that is a female troubadour, is someone out looking for adventure, that tells a story but doesn't tell it in a narrative line. And so I started reading Non Sempre Ricordano, and I wanted to translate it, and it's what I've been working on most recently. And the images here are Patrizia Vicinelli at Poesia sui Muri in Modena in '67, and an edition of Tam Tam, which was part of Edizioni Geiger, run by Maurizio Spatola, the brother of Adriano Spatola. And so she was involved in all of these things, but she was always on the outside. I was also thinking of her in terms of the avant-garde, and I like to have this quote from Rosalind Krauss about the avant-garde, because I think she embodies all those things, but she's also a woman, and since we're here at this conference talking about women writing poetry. The avant-garde artist has worn many guises over the first 100 years of his existence: revolutionary, dandy, anarchist, aesthete, technologist, mystic. And Patrizia Vicinelli embodied all of those things. I also think that she's different than a lot of Italian poets, and that she really sets out, she doesn't care what other people are doing also in her lifestyle. She makes moves that maybe could be judged quite easily from mainstream society. And this poem of hers that's up here, I'm tired of telling everyone my story because I don't understand it. My story. They don't believe it's mine, and I'll end up believing that my story isn't someone else's, is someone else's. So I also think in trying to translate her, it's important not to overstep. So it's this striking a balance of where does the translator belong, what can I do with this text that somehow honors her, but also honors the ethos of the poems themselves. And the first attempt I made at translating her was Mesmer. She wrote a pretty unconventional novel called Mesmer, which is another story of a journey of a woman escaping. And so I translated a piece of it and I performed it at Short Theater in Rome a few years ago. And in this performance, I wanted to think of embodying these poets who I admired so dearly in an attempt to translate them, but also insert my story into them, because it felt like it couldn't just be a straight translation. The poems were so personal that I wanted to make them personal for myself as well. And so I wrote this text. I'm just going to read the first page of it, because it's a blend of translation and my own story. Because Patrizia Vicinelli was so obsessed with language, so obsessed also with making meaning out of language, rather than pulling it apart, she was somehow trying to fill it up with something. I'm the first to tell you that I never wanted to live here. People are always asking me how I ended up here, so far away from home, in a foreign country, in a foreign language. And I never have a good answer. I'd lived in Italy before, liked living in Italy, but my only experience with Bologna was the now defunct Nutella Cafe on Via Righi on a 2-hour stopover on my way home to Florence. In 2017, I left Bologna for a while, only to find shortly thereafter that it was my true home. Funny how that happens, isn't it? Kathy Acker, who in fact, in many ways, Patrizia Vicinelli's long-lost sister, wrote in her novel Don Quixote, "Language presupposes community. Therefore, without you, nothing I say has any meaning. Here is a translation, an essay, a poem for an audience of one. I live a life in translation, and though we all do, I'm always aware of it, highly conscious of how what's on the outside and on the inside are always only tangentially attached. To go to Rome, to catch any train that leaves after midnight. I won't find even one hotel, and you're jealous? I empty out my closet, dump sweaters into the donation bin outside, leaving Bologna, as Dante points out in De Volgari Eloquentia, if we are hunting for an illustrious form of Italian, our prey is not to be found in any of these cities. These cities has Bologna at the top of the list. This language with its nasal sounds, with its constant lisp, its overzealous French inflections, tss, tss, tss. Creely, form is never more than an extension of content. This mouth of mine makes the forms you've taught it. All of a sudden, the repeated actions of mouth and even of writing become stilted. Extremely jealous, he said, while kissing the palms of her hands, Who knows if this discussion interests me? Two assholes, she thought, bourgeois, etc. And it was like in old films, humid and foggy. There at the station, you discover the true essence of the city. Smoky and foggy, in the full throes of winter, a city within a valley. We'll see if what they say about Rome is true, that it's more beautiful, hotter, at least this. I shiver. It must be fear. So this kind of blending of texts is something I'm quite interested in doing. Obviously, there's the question of service in a translation, and I think, however, there's space for both of these things. I think both texts can exist at the same time. So to not only think of translation as a service, as a way of giving more readers and making something accessible, but also keeping the text alive through play and through experimentation, and adding our own voices to them. One of the things that I've found to be helpful is reading some of the theoretical texts written by some of Patrizia Vicinelli's peers. And I shared this idea with Alberto Masola the other night, and we got in a bit of an argument about Adriano Spatola, because they were all friends, but Spatola had a very different attitude towards poetry than Patrizia Vicinelli, and frankly, quite a very different attitude towards life, in that for Vicinelli, poetry was what held the world together. That's how she kept her life together, I would argue, is that language allowed her to keep some kind of coherence, whereas Spatola was very busy using language to destroy whatever existed. But he wrote this incredible text called Poesia Totale, in which he makes an argument for a really different attitude towards what poetry can do in the world. And when I read it, and it's written in 1969, so about 20 years after Charles Olson's projective verse. But for me, the two texts actually have quite a dialogue. So this is a really short excerpt from this essay, which is accessible online on Maurizio Spatola's online archive. Society accepts poetry because it needs poetry to justify one's existence in the eyes of all the wretched who can't even imagine that there could be someone who says to himself, I am a poet. Poetry, therefore, is already dead, and yet it is still alive. The poet's job now is to deny through one's work that privileged situation that the poets of yesterday, in making their will, have left as an inheritance to the poets of today. The poet, therefore, oscillates between a long-term cultural action and a series of terroristic gestures. However, it is naive to ask the poet to survive through daily self-harm exercises. The mental dimension in which the poet can become a pure tension, decidedly unhooked from memory, which is always also a fetishization of reality, and therefore a celebration of the status quo. The transition from poetry as poetry to a form of total poetry is the only way to use it positively and concretely, in the direction of an anarchically guaranteed utopia, that experience of language that the poet is so far used to having as an end in itself. And for me, this is also advocating what Vicinelli is doing with her work. So it's not a poetry of one sort. It's a poetry that can be sounded off. It's a poetry that is concrete and visual. It's a poetry that is fully embodied. And whether she and Spatola had the same goals or the same ideas about what language does, I think this applies to both of their works, and that language is the thing, whether it's to be destroyed or to be reconstructed. So it's something that's extremely malleable. So the poem that I have here on the handout is Non sempre ricordano. It's currently available in this edition from Argo Editions, which just came out. It's a nice little pocket-sized book. And it also, so there's been all this resurgence, and last year it came out from Axis in Torino, which is a small experimental publisher. They made an LP of Patrizia reading this poem. Not the whole thing, because it is an epic poem. And so it's on a disc. And so I was listening to it the other day as I was working on this presentation over and over again, and I wanted to share with you this piece of the text that is here in Italian, that she's reading. So it's about a minute and a half long, and I just recorded it from the turntable at home.
Tuonavano gli spiriti dei dormienti santi fino ad allora in siesta o in passeggiata silenziosa, veli, camicie, respiri. Tutti intorno le valli del desiderio emergono e abissi sopra abissi, crateri che occuperanno valanghe per altri nemici inespugnabili. Danze sprenate in cui si progetta lussuria per l'incontentabile notte dell'uomo esangue che parte, ultimo viaggio, uccelli che si abbattono al suolo e in qualche caso volano senza sosta verso l'alto. Tintinnano e gli elmi di quelli uccisi questa notte durante un'avventura con la morte, un incontro appunto fatale, tuonare d'estate, arrampicandosi su per la vite americana che era verde, legato con fili di nylon e chiodi alla parete, su fino ai battenti della finestra chiusa della mia stanza di ospite del tuo palazzo di campagna stile Novecento. Oh, amico re.
I love listening to her. I really listened to this over and over again the other day. It was probably not a healthy choice. So this kind of worksheet is how I've been trying to work on the text. It's obviously a performative example since I made photocopies for all of you. But there's different phases of the translation that it's going through. So trying to first make an initial translation with all of the options that I'm thinking of, then kind of going based on instinct, listening to her words, thinking of what sounds good versus what doesn't sound good, and then sort of a finalized version of bringing all of those things together. And then in the handwritten sections, kind of the thoughts that I'm thinking and the ideas that I would like to bring into the translation so that it can eventually become another poem born out of this poem. And so there's some theoretical texts that I was thinking of as I was writing it, like Johannes Goransson's Transgressive Circulation, which is a text that I think suits this author quite well. Also Dante's Del Volgare Eloquentia, thinking about the mother tongue, the father tongue, where languages come from, the different varieties of Italian as well, because as opposed to an actor reading a poem, which happens quite often in an Italian context, Patrizia Vicinelli's language is extremely marked with a Bolognese accent, and thinking how all of these things fit together. And so there's also kind of a poem that I've written, stealing lines from the Italian and the English translation. And I just wanted to end with a quote of Vicinelli's that I think is really important to this sort of thinking about integrating our own text with translations, but also to her entire ethos of poetics. And it's from a short essay that she wrote, Ideological Declaration. To learn something and keep it for yourself is part of the ethics of possession and private conservation which belong to the ideology of the bourgeoisie. I'm coming out of the silence that was imposed on me through social judgment and that I then chose and maintained for 7 years. Today I realize that persisting in a behavior of non-communicative isolation coincides with a solipsistic and individualist position in the negative sense of bourgeoisie existentialism. You need to therefore scream about what you believe in. Let it be known how it came to be, even more so if the message has something to do with the individual and social reality of everyone. You cannot feel yourself to be consciously free if others are not free. We use words, even if this method of communication is worn out and abused, to try and make concrete our thoughts, that in the end are a way of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Next presenting, direct from New York, NYU, Professor Eugene Ostashevsky.
I'm going to talk about translingualism as a form of anti-translation, or at least anti-conventional idea of translation, as something that challenges the assumptions that we bring to translation. And I'm going to start with a quote from Minai Mizumura, from a Japanese novelist, whose first novel, Shishozetsu, From Left to Right, is written in Japanese with a generous sprinkling of English words. The genre is a vague equivalent of autobiography. But what's cool about the novel, what is really unusual about it in Japanese context is, I mean, we've all seen books in Japanese, you know, you read up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. This is left to right, okay? And it's about her life in the US. And the way, looking back at the novel, she says, I tried through the bilingual form to make a case for the irreducible materiality of all languages, okay? And this is what I think translingualism does. For me, just the fact of taking the standard writing direction of Japanese and putting it on the side is a prime example of translingualism. And the point of it is to emphasize the materiality of Japanese and to contrast it with the materiality in English, okay? And the second step of it is not just materiality, but to say that here, the semantics, the meaning which is made by this materiality is actually also irreducible, okay? When I thought of the idea of Alfabeti del Corpo, my association was, I've worked on Henry V for a while in graduate school. And because Henry V is, in a way, the play of Shakespeare that's most obsessed with the politics of language. And it has one of Shakespeare's language learning scenes. There's another one, The Merry Wives of Windsor. During a successful invasion of France by the English in 1415, the French princess, who knows that because of English military successes, she will be married to the invader, to the King of England, whether she wants to or not, is learning English. The scene is in French, so there are people in the audience, ostensibly, who can laugh at the jokes. We have two versions of it, as very often in Shakespeare. The quarto, the kind of cheap, pirated version, and the folio, the nice, posthumous, proofread edition, which don't match in many, many, many lines. The quarto, as so often is about half of the material, full of mistakes. I'm not going to go through this scene directly. You can do this very easily at home if this interests you. What is indicative about this scene, and the reason that I thought of it, is that she is learning body parts. She is asking for the English word for the hand, for fingers, for the elbow, for the neck, and so on and so on. And as so often in language it ends in obscenity, okay? She asks how to say le pied et la robe, the foot and the gown or the dress. And, you know, she's told foot, and, you know, if you speak any teenage French, it's foutre, right? La robe becomes con, right? So she's completely scandalized. What's amazing about the scene and what is translingual about it are the pronunciation mistakes that she makes. And the pronunciation mistakes are not typesetter's errors because different versions of them appear in both texts. And they're very consistent, okay? So instead of nails, she says males. And you're like, okay, males. Instead of arm, she says arma, right? Arma virumque cano, right? So you already have arma, you have males as in coat of males. For neck, she mistakenly pronounces it as nick. Menton becomes sin instead of chin. Elbow becomes bilbo. And this is something that, you know, sounds like, we don't know the word bilbo. It's not an English word that is in usage. If you look it up in the OED, it's a sword made in Bilbao. Okay? So basically, the whole politics of the marriage, the whole reason of the marriage is expressed without being said expressly in the puns, in the mistakes that she makes, right? With the intended spectator being bilingual enough to get the jokes. I'm not going to go through robe as rob, right, which is obvious, con as count, right? This is a very common sexual but also mathematical pun that you get not just in Shakespeare. And I'm just going to arrive at the moral, like a sermon on speed. So you show this thing to students and you're like, can this be translated into English, right? What is lost when you don't read this scene bilingually? Well, the whole meaning of this scene is lost. And this is a way you introduce students to the meaningfulness of language choice, right? To the fact that language choice brings in its own semantics, okay? Brings in its own nuances, which are not always, but very, very, very often are political. Language choice is political. It depends who is in the room, in the broad sense of the word, whether you want this person to understand or not, and so on and so forth. And it also depends on the political, social, economic power that we associate with the speakers of this or that language, right? The question is, what is the difference between this kind of multilingual play and a text which is democratic because it is made completely accessible for consumption by the monolingual reader, right? The problem is that the meaning is gone. Okay, this is the connection between materiality or untranslatability and semantics and meaning. There's a kind of assumption in standard translation of translation equivalence, right? This is kind of what Alison was just talking about, rather the lack of translation equivalence. How do I translate voice, this person's voice, right? Part of the meaning of the reception of this person's voice, right, is that it's this person's voice, right? How do I make it shareable to others, right? Or in a very broad sense, how do I translate presence? Yeah, because translation is really about absence. Yeah, how do I represent present? There is a political problem behind the assumption of translation equivalence, and this is that the monolingual reader gets the sense that they understand everything, right? It's a particular problem with the English language reader because of the power of English, because of the privilege that comes with speaking English and writing in English. Virtually everywhere now, in any kind of international setting for writers, when you apply for prizes, when you apply for anything international, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, you have two options, local language or English, right? So there's a huge amount of privilege that comes with Englishing. Mizumura's terrific book on the power of English, The Fall of Language in the Age of English, and the effect that kind of commercial US publishing has on other literatures, because people need to be translated into English to have, any kind of international career, okay? This is like, I'm a translator into English, and I have people approaching me all the time asking to be translated, right? And I feel like I'm Odysseus who goes down to the underworld and all the shades like Or Dante, right? Everybody wants to pass a message, you know? And it's not really nice. I mean, it gives the translator a kind of power that, I don't know, I don't want it. And this is something that we don't talk about enough. So for me, not for everybody, translingual writing often has a broader sense. For me, it has a very specific sense. It's writing that foregrounds linguistic multiplicity to the effect that more than one language may be present physically in the text, or sometimes present but not physically. It's writing that foregrounds, that emphasizes linguistic difference, points to the translation process, as Rob has already said, and tensions in the translation process. It's critical of translation equivalence, obviously. It's writing that foregrounds linguistic relativity and relates to some forms of neo-Worfianism in the sense that it emphasizes that what is said in one language is different from the exact same thing said in another language. And finally, it's writing that in a certain sense responds to speech patterns that are characteristic not of the traditional idea of bilingualism, which is I am bilingual if I speak two languages perfectly, but to the modern idea of bilingualism that appears in multilingualism studies, which is the complementarity principle put forth by François Grosjean, whose idea is that people who are bilingual are not two parallel monolinguals, but are stronger in this domain in one language, weaker in the same domain in another language, and they have different domains where their languages are dominant. Okay, so it's a much more nuanced, multidimensional view. There are other nuances to it. And the final thing is, this is a poem by Murat Nimet-Nejad, who is a poet in New York, Persian Jewish, but born in Turkey, immigrated in the early 60s, a while ago. And you can see by this poem, of which I quote maybe, I don't know, the first half, something that I think is also typical for translingual poems, which is really heightened metalinguistic concerns. In other words, you never talk about things without talking about things. Yeah? And if you talk about things directly, if you forget the role of language, for me, that's not really a translingual poem, right? And here, the example of Murat, who is remembering something in Ankara by taking the word Ankara and by breaking it down into different Turkish words and similar sounding words and building his whole memory, right, based from these word fragments. That's a prime example of the kind of heightened attention to the role of language in the role of linguistic multiplicity in constructing our daily lives. Okay, does that make sense, more or less? Okay. Good, thank you.
Our final panelist is Jennifer Scapatone.
Thank you so much to everyone who made this possible. I'm going to present just a few pages redacted from a book of mine that's about translingualism that I just finished 2 days ago in Florence and ritually handed in at the home of Amelia Rosselli's grandmother, who begins this piece. So thank you for making that ritual possible. So the one thing that I need to tell you, just in case, is that this book is about xenoglossia, which is a term that is introduced to French and then English in 1907 to refer to the use of languages by people who are not native to those languages and who have not learned them. And it's a sort of paranormal phenomenon. But what I've written about in this book is the resurgence of what I'm calling Pentecostal aspirations. And the thing I need to explain, just in case you don't know it, is that Pentecost in Acts of the Apostles is the story whereby the punishment at the Tower of Babel, according to which, God struck down the tower and made everyone speak different languages so that they could not communicate and cooperate. This is healed in Acts of the Apostles by way of the descent of the Holy Spirit, wind, or breath. So throughout the book, I look at examples over the course of the 20th century, but especially after fascism. The book is called Poetry After Barbarism, in which this dream is resurgent, and yet all of these people, except the first, are anti-fascists and anti-colonial, and how exactly you make for a dream of a universal language has to look fundamentally different than it did under fascism. In December 1945, Amelia Pinkerle Rosselli, an acclaimed dramaturge, translator, political activist, and feminist, was preparing to return to Florence from Larchmont, New York. She had endured 8 years of exile across 4 countries, during which she served as matriarch for the widows and children of her assassinated sons. Hailing from a secular Jewish family with a distinguished history of involvement in the Italian nation, these sons, Carlo and Nello, were murdered by French fascist terrorists in 1937 for their work in the global anti-fascist resistance. Rosselli wrote her friend Piero Calamandrei, a center-left politician who had sent her his memoir of the Tuscan countryside. You cannot imagine what it means for those living far away from their own country, from their own language, to hear it resound like this as a song of ineffable sweetness. È come una musica, said one of my young granddaughters yesterday, whom I made read aloud to make her more sure of her Italian, which is, alas, vacillante. And it seemed to me the most exacting and summarizing judgment. The 15-year-old made to read and proclaiming it musical was Amelia's namesake, the daughter of Carlo, resistance theorist and frontline fighter, who was in the womb during his storied escape from fascist confinement on the island of Lipari, and by consequence born in Paris in 1930. The granddaughter was Amelia Rosselli, for whom, as refugee between France, Switzerland, England, and New York State for the first 7 years of life, the Italian language emerged as vacillating or wavering between experiences, something of a foreign tongue closer to the abstraction of lyricism, demanding practice in reading out loud. The younger Amelia's lifelong penchant for music would formalize itself shortly thereafter, but she routed musical research increasingly through language in the practice of poetry. The same instinct that could have enabled the young Amelia to proclaim a passage of Italian prose to be like music also encapsulated the reason for which she would never be able to express a sentiment such as her grandmother's, wherein the privilege of ownership could be applied to a state and its language, such that one can measure the distance from their own country, from their own language. Being born into exile of an English mother and an Italian father in flight made that impossible. Her Italian was a motherless tongue. The younger Amelia Rosselli became a poet, translator, and cultural critic, her writing invoking global literary traditions with a liberty modeled by modernist US poetry, which she read in the original languages. Composed in Italian, English, and French, her poetry strikes up colloquy with Hopkins, Rimbaud, Joyce, Campana, Pasternak, Lowell through Plath and Berryman, the Black Mountain School, and post-war leftist investigations of the working class cultures of southern Italy by key literary companions such as Pier Paolo Pasolini and Rocco Scotellaro. But Rosselli's poetics were shaped equally by years of musicological study with wellsprings in Bach through Bartók, the folk research of Ernesto de Martino, and concrete and electronic music. This education evolved through workshops with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, David Tudor, Luciano Berio, and others at the Darmstadt School for New Music and Dartington College of the Arts, research at the Rai Phonology Studio for Electronics, where works such as John Cage's Fontana Mix were created. In 1965, Rosselli, having just published her first collection of poetry, accompanied by a tractate on meter, would make a bold claim for the music that she was seeking. I aspire to pan music, to the music of everyone, of the earth and of the universe, in which an individual hand no longer governs. This ideal of arriving at the music of everyone would find itself in constant battle, however, with the dissonance of her aesthetics and what turned out to be Rosselli's irreparable status of outsider in every country, particularly given that her musicality ended up settling in the realm of language, a medium scored against pan-lyricism with geopolitical divisions. Rosselli harbored a lifelong obsession with the harmonic series, or the sequence of natural overtones that resonate when plucking a string or blowing through a column of air, including the one shared by the vocal cords. These overtones are an organic outcome of the physics of vibration and the basis of all musical scales and tuning. Every fixed pitch in a string or wind instrument, including that of our voices, is actually a composite, the sum of the dominant pitch that we hear and a series of higher pitches that become gradually less perceptible as they increase in distance from the base. The harmonic series can be thought of as a chord embedded within any resonant musical note or speech event, and a key factor in our differentiation of noise, wherein overtones are so dense that we cannot perceive pitch, from less dissonant sound. Human perception of these overtones is routinely edited out, however, by adult brains that have learned to distinguish coherent chunks of content, such as words or fixed pitches. Ethnomusicologist Mark van Tongeren argues in a 2023 study for expanded listening practices that incite awareness of these hidden yet omnipresent harmonies. Becoming aware of the overtones resounding through your mouth every time you speak is something like learning that your body is 90% water. Rosselli, having begun to study piano and violin in London, anticipates this study by more than 70 years as she became interested in exploring tuning and harmonics outside of the tempered scale in the 1950s, influenced by her exposure to Bartók and to the notion that traditional Western harmonic systems and sonorities had collapsed. In her first published essay, she argued that new research in acoustics pointed to a way forward for music and musicology, to develop one's musical ear so as to intuit the natural scales, apprehending new musical possibilities organically. Rosselli was also indebted to musicologist Alain Danieux, who contoured ways in which the laws of music, bridging physics and metaphysics, reflect the natural attunement of the world. Danielou cites the 2nd century BCE writings of Dong Zhongzhu. Harmony between heaven and earth and humankind comes from a tuning on the same note, producing vibrations in unison. This ideal of relationality through attunement recalls the aspirations of Rosselli's pan music. It also resonates with that of more immediate literary elders influenced by modernism, yet occupying a different relation to hegemonic languages, like Lithuanian Jewish modernist Louis Zukofsky. Zukofsky maintained that the upper limit of musicality enabled poetry as acoustic material to transcend the divisions of communicability that find their apotheosis in grammar books. It is this musical horizon of poetry that permits anybody who does not know Greek to listen and get something out of the poetry of Homer, to tune in to the human tradition, to its voice, and thus escape the confines of a time and place. In this sense, poetry is international. In spite of the lofty ideals of thinkers pressed to surpass the nationalism of the first half of the 20th century, the language of poetry continues to be wielded as a mechanism of division as well as of attunement. Poetries resounding as dissonant, such as Rosselli's On the Page and Off, remain subject to the whims of nationalist ideological conditioning both before and long after the world wars. Her voice was received as foreign due to the identification of certain tendencies in her accent as anathema, inadmissible deviations from the presumed standard. Even the assessment of her grandmother of her Italian as ahimè vacillante expresses a relative's incapacity to hear the young readers wavering between sonic and semantic systems, the vibration as harmonic enrichment and, moreover, part and parcel of the Italian state, rather than the singular fate of an individual tragically severed from the socio-political collective. So that Rosselli's Pentecostal aspirations to arrive at pan music and heal the divisions of Babel through a purely communal music are lacking a Holy Spirit. Instead, they are presided over by the holy ghosts of more than one parental tongue. Rosselli is aware of the caprices and ignorance behind charges of dissonance, noting that an ear unattuned to superior harmonies can dismiss them as discordant, off-key. She speaks of how imprecise the notion of dissonance is, because it is generated by a more or less sensitive perception of superior harmonics. At the dawn of her career as a poet, Rosselli would report to Pasolini that the editor, Elio Vittorini, seemed so embarrassed by my linguistic ductility or anarchy, fused, invented, or deformed, or archaizing words, that he asked me to correct the off-key notes, stonature, as much as possible. She added, I wrote to him communicating my decision not to change that language, at times resonating as distorted at all. Finding that current instruments based on the tempered scale cannot express this still unknown species of acoustic halo, alone, that we seek, a 21-year-old Rosselli undertook the design of an experimental keyboard that reproduced the first 64 harmonics. In 1952, Amelia writes to her grandmother that perhaps such instruments will come to replace those based on the tempered scale and those with fixed keys, and that the ear will come to adapt itself to a subtler conception of melodic relations and will more precisely mirror this species of fixed scale that we carry within us, invisible from the time that music was born. Commentators on Rosselli have generally been more befuddled than enlightened by this seemingly arcane musicological passion. I propose that harmonics can help us attune more perspicuously to the ghostings, or in the musicological terminology, the sonorous halos of tongues foreign to the linguistic fundamentals of Rosselli's writings. These hauntings of languages beyond the mother or fatherland for which she composed at any given time are apprehensible not only through diction and syntax, but through sonic channels of rhythm and accent, such as in Caroline Bergvall's animal-inhabited, cross-trafficked, autographic throat. Cat is the tone in my speech, its accentedness, its autography. So what if I were to decide to talk with a cat in the throat? Though audiences of her poetry in distinct national languages have been conditioned to treat these lingual sculptings as anathema, heralds of the stranger, I propose that we understand them in harmonic terms as chords.
Heavy fat hands, said the executioner, the hatchet fell, down upon their bodily stripped souls fermenting in the dust. You are a stranger here, and have no place among us.
A comment on the displacing effect of Rosselli's language is symptomatic of her lasting marginality within Italian literary circles, indicative of the way her voice testifies to a hovering between the phonetic norms of nation states. One doesn't understand where it comes from. In the seemingly homogeneous population of Italy, Rosselli's accent is the source of ample fascination and provincial condescension. I have heard Rosselli's pronunciation characterized as other to English, French, and Italian colleagues alike. Recent writings on accent have begun to transform understanding of this all too naturalized concept of lingual difference. The supposedly neutral accent of any locus or state is actually a particular masquerading as a universal, a mechanism for redrawing false binaries, people with accents, people without accents, based on the sounds of ethnic, regional, and/or class difference. Rosselli's Pentecost, presided over by a Holy Ghost, asks for us to swell received geopolitical frameworks as it tests well-worn demarcations of nation, region, dialect, even diaspora, distinguishing its own transnational sphere of political aspiration while disbelonging in ways that reigning academic categories cannot easily classify. Accent does not demarcate mappable social or regional locations. Rather, accented speech and listening muddy and proliferate geopolitical space, write the editors of Thinking with an Accent. They describe accent as an irregular and itinerant concoction of contagiously accumulated voices. The pertinence of this descriptor to Rosselli's mid-century poetics shows how germane her oeuvre is to the contemporary textual soundscape. Rosselli's rejection of the lyric of the confessional first person, her striving to express collective experience at a scale that defied the provincialism of her day, must ultimately be judged as successful by careful readers, given the fertile muddying of geographies and proliferation of tonalities that her saying of grime achieves. Her poetry extends the work of her anti-fascist elders in troubling geopolitical boundaries through transgressions of nationalist communication channels.
What woke those tender, heavy, fat hands?
The voice of Rosselli itself places us between loci. The dilated vowels, the percussiveness of these phonemes estrange English from itself, ensure an estrangingly musical experience, yet one impossible to consign to the category of glossolalia or babble. After 14 years of translating Amelia Rosselli, I found myself faced in terms more immediate than ever with the task of transmitting her voice to an English-speaking audience. Invited to give a reading at a salon in a colleague's home, I decided to present a section from Locomotrix. Though I could try to echo Rosselli's lexical choices with English parallels, lacking access to a sound system, I was forced to confront the heresy of relaying the voice of the Italian text with my own. A performer for theater as well as concert settings, Rosselli evolved a powerful practice of reciting her own poems. The sounded aspect of her work is also crucial because accent, the sound of language perceived to be within or outside the domain of one's so-called mother tongue, continues to be one of the most blatant ways in which belonging is policed, one of the most trenchantly embedded signs of who is us and who is other. Wishing to convey these crucial contexts for a difficult body of verse in the bare intimacy of a Midwestern living room, I found myself feeling obliged to re-perform as opposed to solely reading the original and translated texts of the polyglot poet musicologist. So I'm going to play a few seconds of this.
Dalla mia e vostra vita terrorizzata, se resistere dipende dal cuore, piuttosto dalle sottane sarà rotta la mistinguette, la vita è sbersata per un attimo ancora, se sesso è così rotativo da apparire poi, vana questo recitativo che mi faceva passare per pazza quando arrotandomi dietro ad ogni scrivania, sorvegliavo i vostri desideri d'essere lontani dalla mia, rotativa nella notte specchiata nel lucido del vetro che copre le vostre indifferenze alla mia stralunante morte.
Rosselli's performances have a linguistically vacillating quality, which is to say a vibrational quality, creating halos of sound, of experience, and of meaning. The way that Rosselli recites the third section of Impromptu estranges listeners from the messages it bears. It is as if the melody, the accentuation, the pulsation of the text of the recitative exists on a plane above and beyond its semantic value, as an autonomous complex of assonant or dissonant phonemes. Rosselli's reading, like her writing, follows a musical and perceptual as opposed to narrative trajectory of association. It is inherently polyphonous, wherein melody and rhythm drift from expected standards of spoken stress, manifesting independent agency. One example will need to suffice in closing to give a sense of how this studied dilation might manifest. A coinage via the present participle that rhymes with the musical direction andante ends the third section, della mia stralunante morte, of my moon-striking death, is how I translated it for this reason. Other editors of this text duly note that in cleaned up manuscripts, the word stralunante for dazzling or stunning is corrected in favor of the term stralunata, dazed. It is therefore the more compelling that when Rosselli performs the text for the recording included in the 1993 edition, she not only retains the original term, stralunante, but emphasizes it by drawing out the action of bedazzlement vocally. The death in question is not an object moonstruck, but an agent that keeps dazzling. It is aurally and visually moon-striking. Rather than measuring Rosselli's divergence from the phonetic norms of standard Italian, which were famously difficult to impose along the regionally divisive Italian peninsula, much less through its diaspora in a century of emigration and exile, it would be more accurate to think of Rosselli's poetic and actual voice, artifact of a singular fusion of world historical and personal circumstances, as itself plural, comprising reputedly separate cantons of expression come together in a harmonic that native speakers of Italian, English, and French have been trained to recognize as dissonant. Rosselli's is a Pentecost taking place on a vibrational level, never the ideological reworking of the psalm for the complicit nation state, but each psalm haunted by its material echoes, its laboriously embodied transmission, its gravitational pull in other languages. And I'm just going to end with 1 minute of a piece of mine that reflects on the universality of bird song. And so this is literally 1 minute.
Tuhinga o mua, ki te whakamahi, ki te mahi kore.
Una jaula llena de oxígeno para agarrar un monumento cayendo.
一个装满氧气的牢笼，抓住正在掉落的纪念碑。
Une cage pleine d'oxygène pour attraper un monument en train de tomber.
برای نگه داشتن بنای یادبودی که فرو می‌ریزد.
Una gabbia colma di ossigeno per acciuffare un monumento cadente.
充满氧气的笼子，接住坠落的纪念碑。
Thank you. We can talk more about what that was afterwards.
Thank you. So, Jen, I don't know. We started a little late, and so we don't have a lot of time, but we do have some time. And we started late, so should we approach? So we're going to, yeah, I think what we'll do is open this up to Q&A, and at the same time we might talk amongst ourselves, and we can just all be friendly in that kind of way. So thank you to my panelists and for everyone who's here. Anybody have anything on their mind in terms of speaking to any of the three panelists? Or amongst ourselves? I know, I just went through this on Class Wednesday when no one...
I just finished talking, so...
So I guess I'm just, and this goes for all of you in some ways, I guess. When you're talking about translingualism, what assumptions does that make? Translingual writing, what assumptions or conditions, in your opinion, are placed upon the reader? Because I'm just curious what your thoughts or what other people on the panel's thoughts are regarding how potentially monolingual reader or multilingual reader in other languages, languages that could in fact be materially very distant from the translingualism that's being enacted in the text. How do they engage with that kind of text except to say, oh, it goes against these conventions? I guess I'm wondering how translingualism in and of itself enacts a kind of bordering.
So, okay, so if you take kind of a monolingual text, right? A monolingual text appears to have a pretty clearly cut audience, okay? Anybody with sufficient practice in that language, and excludes people who don't have the sufficient knowledge of the language to read it. A translingual text is much more fragmenting with respect to the audience. in that by necessity, it's working with English, you can kind of get a room of bilinguals in English and some other language, right? Like I was just doing a reading in Germany and I was doing poems with pieces of German and English, and I knew that everybody in the room, like nobody would need translation. But that's fairly rare. And in that sense, when the text is translingual in the sense of including several languages or more than one language, it functions like code switching. Some people are left out, some people get a greater sense of intimacy. I don't think that's particularly liberational, except for other bilinguals of those languages. I just think it's a legitimate way to work, and those are very, very different things. I don't think it's necessarily. I don't think everything has to be a moral category. Okay. At the same time, having said that, I'm going to say the opposite. At the same time, you know, especially working in modern poetry, this whole, you know, assumption that anybody who speaks the language can understand it is just not true, right? You know, if you take somebody like Prynne, of the millions and millions and millions of English speakers all over the world, you know, how many people can look at Prynne and be like, oh, wait, that's actually English, right? So there, at least in the field of poetry, at least in the field of like non-commercial literature, right? That kind of decision, that kind of division exists as well, except translingualism accentuates it. The second or the third thing that I want to say here is that not all translingual texts need to have several languages. And some can just emphasize translation issues, or some can present the other language as Murat does in his poem, where I don't read Turkish, but that poem to me is fairly accessible, right? Not just because he translates the words. If he just translated the words, to me it would not be translingual. It's because he uses the sound shape of the Turkish words as a constructing principle in building the poem. To me, that's what makes it translingual. But I can still read the work.
Can I follow up? I've thought about this a lot too, and I agree with everything Eugene said. But one thing about the works that I've been thinking about, of which this chapter on Rosselli is the longest and the central chapter, is that these texts foreground the scene of learning, and they, I mean, I'm gonna use a buzzword, but like they decolonize the scene of learning. And so that you need to unlearn what you already know, and you're hailed not in some sort of ideological state apparatus sense, but you're called into the poem to try to figure it out and try to exceed your current masteries or what you think of as masteries. So they perform unmastery so as to critique education and indoctrination into national grammars. And so they are unlearned. And so that's why, for me, the term xenoglossia was important, because it's unlearned and unauthorized. So it's not a cosmopolitan pastiche or collage of different learned citations where you're supposed to, you know, be part of the formation of a new canon a la T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. But it's like totally disorienting, but usually there are some bits that draw you in. And let's face it, right now, everyone can find some way to get onto the internet and like look some stuff up, you know? And so that changes things a lot. Like when I lived in Japan a gajillion years ago, I couldn't do that. But now, you know, you have so many different apps and so forth. And so, you know, as depressing as that is for a translator, it also makes more possibilities for translingual texts flourish.
I wanted to add something also, because I really appreciated what you said, Eugene, about just because you can read the language doesn't mean you can actually read the poem. And also this idea of education. And I think translingualism really, at least as I see it, is more about a process and a kind of a busting open of the poem. I mentioned that there's a theater company in Bologna working on something about Patrizia Vicinelli. And it's funny because I've been working with them because they became kind of obsessed with the personality of her, but none of the members of the company had any experience with experimental poetry, with thinking about concrete poetry. And so Italian's my second language. They're all Italian native speakers, but we needed our combined understanding of poetry and language to actually access the works together. And it's become sort of a process of learning from each other, because there are things I don't understand because of my later approach at the language. So I think for me, it's more about this idea of pushing things so that you understand it's an anti-mastery thing. I think that's maybe what you said, Jennifer.
So I was very compelled by both claims about translation, one of which was this idea of the irreducible materiality of all languages. So that was from you. And then also this notion of like the Pentecostal and the Spirit. But I realized after the end of all the talks that they're kind of opposites of one another. So I was just curious about and you're saying something that is like related, you're saying something that is related or somewhat similar. So I'm curious where your kind of spirit matter Cartesian distinction comes from, or what that means to you. Yeah, I suppose that's my question. And then also it got the Creeley quote got my kind of brain thinking about this, the form as an extension of content. So yeah, I was just curious about that. And also then I wanted to ask Alison about Patrizia Vicinelli, and also we were just talking before about like the difficulty of translating her due to her complicated syntax. But when I was reading your translations, I was also thinking about the place of like commas and all these minor things that actually make such a difference to what the meaning might be, because the syntax is so undecidable. And so like how the meaning rests really on like these epiphenomena or something like that. And I don't know, maybe you have things to say about that.
I guess I could just make like a really short and try to answer in a really quick way your first question about, they are opposites. And so what has interested me over the past 14 years of writing this book and also translating Amelia Rosselli is the tension, the friction between the desire to exceed those material differences, you know, through material difference. So there's an inherent contradiction there. And I think that many people would share the aspiration, but not to the extent of like formulating all these theories and formulating an entire body of work in relation to it. I mean, many people want to be understood, you know, but to not take the path of accessibility through sort of totally linear, frontal, confessional, or what have you, kind of seemingly accessible poetry, but instead to make the most difficult poetry that highlights and like puts on display the material differences of language. You get kind of Babel and Pentecost all in the same package, which becomes then very explosive and very compelling, but honestly, for those of us who have the patience for it. For many people, this is just anathema, and this work will continue to be marginalized.
If I can do a super quick footnote on interpretations of the Pentecostal idea, right? The idea produces what, at least at first glance, are completely opposite effects. So on the one hand, you have the kind of the Christian missionary activity and the translational aspect of it, right? Which translates the scriptures into lots and lots of languages, which designs writing systems for orality languages and standardize them for the purpose of translation. Okay, so there's that kind of aspect. But then if you look at the idea in like glossolalia in Pentecostal churches, but in other glossolalic cults, I don't know if cult is a polite word here, it's probably not, but religious factions, okay? You basically have the same idea producing sound poetry, producing speaking in tongues, okay? And with the avant-garde tradition in Russia, the emergence of purely abstract poetry, right? Purely abstract sound poetry of words that are not dictionary words and that are not comprehensible. Pretty much the first thing that they used as the justification for its existence is speaking in tongues, glossolalia, in the Russian version of, non-Protestant version of Pentecostalism. So, same biblical incident, completely opposite results.
And your question about syntax in Vicinelli, we were talking about it this morning too. So in the original archival version, which is in the box in her son's apartment, actually, of this poem, Non sempre ricordano, which is here on the page, it's actually written over and over with her handwriting. So there are multiple versions of the poem. And I think that's also why I felt free to kind of scribble on it and work like that myself. And I've been trying to figure out if there is, what kind of connection there is between the written poem and the spoken poem, and how close they are connected. And my response would probably be, after having listened a lot to her, is that it's kind of like a score, a musical score. And that the indications are for her to read in a particular way, but they vary and change as well. And I also think, looking at her concrete poetry, that there was also probably something of just a fetishism for the way things look. And thinking about how language can disintegrate on the page and how she can somehow make these sounds replicable to someone else. So giving the person the experience of reading how she sounds. But for example, this tuonare that has all of the periods between each letter, she reads it tuonare, but you can hear each marked letter, right? So each syllable. So that's what makes me think that it's something like a score. But the grammar, yeah, it's difficult to understand sometimes. It's like words are also there just because they sound right to her, I think, which I can appreciate a lot.
Maybe we should pause here and carry on our conversation over coffee. So if you would like to, we can, move into the, great. Okay, thanks again for attending, and to my lovely panelists, and we'll see you over some coffee.